The waiting room outside the operating theater had 4 plastic chairs, a vending machine that only accepted coins, and my mother-in-law sitting perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the door I had just walked through wearing scrubs. "Mira," she said when the surgical registrar told her I would be leading the operation. "You?" I didn't have time to answer her properly. I had 11 minutes before I needed to be scrubbed in, and her husband, my father-in-law, Vikram, was on a trolley 2 rooms away with a perforated appendix and a rising heart rate that told me his body had already started fighting a war it might not win without help. "I need you to sign the consent form," I said, quickly. She looked at the form, then at me. "You're going to operate on him? There's no one else available in time." Her hand hovered over the pen. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because this isn't a story about triumphant vindication, and it would be dishonest to pretend my first feeling was confidence. My first feeling was fear, ordinary, human fear, the kind any surgeon feels before an urgent case, mixed with something else entirely, the specific vertigo of being handed responsibility for a man's life by the same family that had spent 6 years telling me I had none. She signed the form. I went to scrub in. "My name is Dr. Meera Chandran. I'm a general and emergency surgeon, and the man on that trolley was about to become the most complicated patient of my career. Not because his condition was unusually rare, but because everyone in that waiting room had spent years believing I was not a real doctor at all. I married into the Chandran family 9 years ago, when I was 28 and finishing the most demanding stretch of my surgical training. My husband Arjun worked in finance, stable hours, a predictable career trajectory, the kind of profession that fit comfortably into dinner conversation without anyone needing further explanation. My profession required constant explanation, and even then, it didn't always land. My mother-in-law, Kamini, came from a family that measured a woman's worth through a very specific lens. Her cooking, her hosting, her ability to manage a household with a quiet efficiency that looked effortless to outsiders and took most of a lifetime to master. Her own life had been built entirely around that skill set, and she was, by any honest account, exceptional at it. Her food was extraordinary. Her home ran like clockwork. She had raised 2 children largely alone while her husband traveled for work, and she had done it with a competence that deserved genuine respect. The problem wasn't her skill. The problem was what she believed skill was allowed to look like. The first real crack appeared about 4 months after the wedding, at a family lunch celebrating my sister-in-law Divya's engagement. Divya had learned to make a particular festival sweet that took 2 full days of preparation, a dish passed down through 3 generations of Chandran women. The lunch became a small ceremony around this achievement. Kamini beamed. Relatives praised Divya's patience, her dedication, her hands. Someone asked what I did. "She's a surgeon," Arjun said, with a note of pride that I still remember clearly, because it was one of the few times that day anyone said it without a qualifier attached. Kamini smiled thinly. "She studies for exams," she said to the table generally, not quite to me. "That's a different kind of skill. Anyone with enough books can pass exams. Divya's skill, this you cannot learn from a textbook." The room laughed lightly, the way rooms do when they haven't quite decided whether something is a joke. I laughed too. I had already learned, in 4 months, that laughing was cheaper than arguing. Over the following years, that comment repeated itself in different forms so many times that I stopped being surprised by it, though I never stopped feeling its edge. When I finished my general surgery residency, Kamini asked whether that meant I would finally have normal hours, like a person with a family. When I published my first research paper on early surgical management of complicated appendicitis in elderly patients, she asked whether I'd had time to learn Arjun's favorite dishes yet. When I was accepted into a fellowship in trauma and emergency surgery, a significant competitive achievement I had worked toward for years, she responded by telling a story at dinner about how Divya had reupholstered an entire sofa herself. I don't think Kamini was a cruel woman. I want to be fair to her, because fairness matters more to me now than it did in those early years, when every comment felt like a verdict rather than a symptom. She was a woman whose entire identity had been built on a form of expertise that the modern professional world had quietly stopped valuing the way it once had. And my presence in her family, someone whose expertise was externally credentialed, publicly validated, expensively trained, unsettled something in her that she never examined directly. It was easier to tell herself that what I did wasn't real skill than to sit with the possibility that skill could take more than one shape, and that her own daughter-in-law's shape happened to be one she couldn't perform herself. That explanation doesn't erase what it cost me. It simply helped me survive it. Arjun defended me in his way, though not always as forcefully as I wanted. He would say, "She saves lives, Ma," and Kamini would say, "I'm not saying she doesn't work hard," which wasn't actually a concession, and the conversation would end there because nobody in that family enjoyed prolonged conflict. We were a family that absorbed tension rather than resolving it. I absorbed a great deal. My own path into surgery had not been effortless, which made the dismissiveness sting in a particular way. Not because I needed praise, but because I knew intimately what the achievement had actually required. I grew up in a middle-income household where my father worked as a pharmacist and my mother taught secondary school mathematics. We were comfortable but not affluent, and medical school fees, even with scholarships, stretched our finances in ways that meant I worked part-time throughout most of my training, tutoring, invigilating exams, one summer working in a pathology lab doing administrative work that had nothing to do with my eventual specialty, but paid enough to cover textbooks. Surgical training itself nearly broke me twice. The first time was in my second year as a registrar, during a rotation in a high-volume trauma unit. I was assisting on a complex bowel resection when I made an error in tissue handling that, while not directly harmful to the patient, my consultant corrected it immediately, shook my confidence badly enough that I considered, seriously, whether I belonged in the specialty at all. I remember standing in the changing room afterward, still in scrubs, feeling the particular kind of shame that doesn't announce itself loudly, but sits in your chest like a stone. My consultant at the time, a formidable woman named Dr. Fernandez, found me there. "You made a mistake," she said. "Not a catastrophe, a mistake. I don't know if I'm cut out for this." Nobody is, in the beginning. That's what training is. You're not supposed to be cut out for it yet. She didn't comfort me further than that. She simply expected me back in theater the next morning, and I was there, and the case went well, and slowly, over years rather than weeks, my hands stopped shaking before difficult cases and started simply doing the work. The second time I nearly quit was during my fellowship, when I was overlooked for a research opportunity in favor of a male colleague with a less developed publication record. The unit head explained it, without apparent self-awareness, as a matter of the colleague being a better fit for the travel commitments, a phrase that everyone present understood to be about my recent marriage rather than my actual capacity. I didn't fight that decision. I regret that, somewhat, even now. I told myself it wasn't worth the political cost, and I redirected my energy into clinical excellence instead, which was, admittedly, the safer path, and possibly also the more honest one for who I was at the time. None of this made its way into Chandran family dinners. Professional obstacles don't translate well into conversation with people who've decided your profession isn't a real achievement to begin with. So I kept that entire dimension of my life separate from my marriage's extended family, presenting them with only the barest outline. I'm a surgeon. I work long hours. Yes, it's demanding. They never asked for more, and I never offered it. By the time I became a consultant, at 34, in emergency general and trauma surgery at Whitmore Regional Hospital, Kamini's comments had softened only slightly, mostly because Arjun had become firmer about shutting them down in front of me, which pushed the commentary into spaces I wasn't present for, conversations Arjun would later, reluctantly, relay to me because he believed in honesty within our marriage, even when honesty was uncomfortable. The most significant of these came about 18 months before Vikram's emergency, during a family gathering I had missed due to an on-call shift. Apparently a cousin had asked what specialty I practiced, and Kamini had said, with what Arjun described as genuine bewilderment rather than malice, "I still don't understand what she actually does all day. She has no real skills that I can see. She just watches machines and signs papers, I think." Arjun told me this in our kitchen, clearly unhappy about repeating it, and I remember standing very still at the counter, feeling something settle inside me that wasn't quite anger. It was closer to grief. Grief for the version of myself that had once hoped, naively, that enough years of proof would eventually change her mind, and the recognition that some people's frameworks are simply not permeable to evidence, no matter how much of it accumulates. "I'm sorry," Arjun said. "You don't need to apologize for your mother." "I know. I'm still sorry." I didn't confront Kamini about it. There didn't seem to be a version of that conversation that would produce anything except more tension absorbed into an already overstuffed silence. I let it settle, the way I'd let so much settle before it, and I went back to work, where my actual skills were, at least, legible to the people who relied on them. 18 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in late spring, Vikram collapsed at his own birthday lunch. I wasn't there. I was on call at Whitmore Regional, in the middle of a quieter shift, reviewing imaging for a patient with suspected gallstone complications, when my phone rang and Arjun's voice came through sounding like it belonged to someone I didn't fully recognize. "Dad's collapsed. Ambulance is coming. He's been complaining of stomach pain for 2 days, but he wouldn't say anything. You know how he is. Where are they taking him?" "I don't know yet. They said the nearest emergency department." "Arjun, which hospital?" A pause while he checked with the paramedic. "Whitmore Regional. My hospital." I want to explain, clearly, what that meant clinically, because this is the part of the story where the emotional weight and the medical weight became inseparable, and I had to hold both without either one compromising the other. When Vikram arrived by ambulance, I was already aware of the situation and had informed my senior colleague, Mr. Ose, immediately, because I understood from the first phone call that if this became a surgical case, I could not simply insert myself as his surgeon without appropriate process. Operating on a family member is something surgical governance takes seriously, and for good reason. Clinical judgment can be compromised by emotional proximity in ways that aren't always visible to the person experiencing them. Vikram's initial assessment showed a man in significant distress: fever, tachycardia, a rigid and tender abdomen with signs consistent with generalized peritonitis. His CT scan, done rapidly given the acuity of his presentation, showed a perforated appendix with free fluid and gas throughout the abdominal cavity, a surgical emergency that required operative intervention without significant delay. Untreated, this kind of presentation carries a real risk of overwhelming sepsis and death, particularly in a man of 68 with underlying hypertension. Mr. Ose was the consultant on call for elective cases that day, not emergency general surgery, and he was 2 hours away at a conference. The other general surgical consultant available for emergencies, Dr. Whitfield, was already in theater with a different urgent case, a bleeding duodenal ulcer that could not be interrupted. I was the emergency general surgery consultant on call. I telephoned Dr. Whitfield's registrar to confirm timing. 40 minutes, minimum, before Dr. Whitfield could scrub out. I telephoned Mr. Ose, who confirmed he could not arrive in under 90 minutes given traffic and distance. I looked at Vikram's vital signs trending on the monitor in front of me. Heart rate climbing past 118, blood pressure beginning to soften at the edges in the specific way that precedes decompensation in septic patients. I made a clinical judgment consistent with hospital protocol for situations involving family members in emergencies. I would proceed as the operating surgeon, with full transparency to the clinical team, with a second surgical registrar present as assist, and with clear documentation of the decision-making rationale. Given that delay carried a materially higher risk than my direct involvement, I informed the theater coordinator. I informed my clinical director by phone, who agreed the decision was appropriate given the timeline. I did not make this decision alone, casually, or without oversight. I made it as a professional operating within a system designed to catch exactly this kind of conflict, and the system, that day, confirmed there was no safer alternative available in time. Then I went to find Kamini for consent. The operation itself took 90 minutes. Vikram had a ruptured appendix with generalized peritonitis, exactly as the scan suggested. We performed a laparoscopic appendectomy, converted partway through to an open procedure, when the inflammation made safe laparoscopic dissection too difficult to continue without unacceptable risk. A judgment call that experienced surgeons learn to make without hesitation, because clinging to a technique for its own sake, when the anatomy is telling you otherwise, is how avoidable complications happen. We performed thorough peritoneal lavage, controlled the source of contamination, and closed with appropriate drains in place given the degree of contamination we found. I did not think about Kamini during the operation. I want to be honest about that, because it would be a cleaner story if I said her voice haunted me through every step, driving me toward some cinematic proof of competence. It didn't. What filled my attention was the anatomy in front of me, the inflamed and fragile tissue, the careful balance between thoroughness and speed that every case like this demands. My hands did what 9 years of training had built them to do, and the rest of the world, including every dismissive comment I had ever absorbed, simply had no room to exist in that space. Vikram's blood pressure stabilized on the table. His temperature began trending down within the first hour post-operatively. He was moved to the surgical high-dependency unit for close monitoring, given the degree of peritoneal contamination, with a plan for intravenous antibiotics and careful monitoring for any signs of ongoing sepsis or abscess formation. I went to speak to the family afterward, still in my scrub cap, because there hadn't been time to change. Kamini stood immediately when I entered the room. Arjun stood beside her. Divya was there too, along with her husband. "He came through the surgery well," I said. "We found a perforated appendix with significant infection in the abdominal cavity. We've cleaned that thoroughly, and he'll need intravenous antibiotics and close monitoring over the coming days, but the surgery itself went as well as we could have hoped." Kamini's hands were pressed together in front of her mouth. "He's going to be all right? The next 48 hours matter. But yes, I'm cautiously optimistic." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice smaller than I had ever heard her use, "You did this yourself?" "With my team, yes." "You cut him open?" "Yes." She looked at her hands. "I didn't know it would look like that," she said. "What you do?" I didn't have a response prepared because I hadn't expected the conversation to arrive here so quickly, in a corridor, still smelling faintly of surgical antiseptic. "It's very technical work," I said, which felt inadequate even as I said it. "I know," she said. "I think I always knew. I don't know why I said the things I said." I looked at her. I had imagined, more than once over 9 years, a version of this moment, an apology, a reckoning, some acknowledgement that would finally settle the account between us. I had imagined feeling triumphant when it arrived. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, and something close to sad, for both of us, for the years we had spent circling each other without ever quite meeting, and for how much simpler this could have been if either of us had found different words earlier. "You don't need to explain it now," I said. "Let's focus on Vikram." She nodded, though I could see she wanted to say more, and didn't yet have the words for it. Vikram remained in hospital for 8 days. His recovery was steady but not without complication. On day 4, he developed a low-grade fever that required additional imaging to rule out an intra-abdominal collection. The scan was reassuring, the antibiotics were adjusted, and his fever settled within 48 hours. This is the kind of recovery that reflects reality rather than fiction, not a single dramatic turn, but a series of small, monitored steps, each one requiring attention rather than assumption. I visited him daily, sometimes in my capacity as a family member, sometimes reviewing his chart with the covering surgical team, and I was careful, throughout, to maintain the professional boundary that governance required. I was not his treating surgeon of record beyond the initial operation, precisely because objectivity matters more than sentiment in ongoing care. Kamini was there every day too. We didn't have a long conversation about the years before. There was no dramatic scene where she listed every comment and apologized for each one individually. That's not how families like ours worked, and I didn't need it to happen that way by then. What changed was smaller, and in some ways more convincing than a speech would have been. She started asking questions about my work, real questions, about how appendicitis was diagnosed, about what the tubes coming out of Vikram's abdomen were for, about how I had known, from a phone call, that the situation was serious enough to require surgery so quickly. I answered patiently, and she listened in the way people listen when they are genuinely trying to understand something, rather than waiting for their turn to speak. 3 weeks after Vikram's discharge, at a smaller family lunch to mark his recovery, Divya's daughter asked what I did for work. Before I could answer, Kamini said, "Your Aunt Mira is a surgeon. She saved your grandfather's life." It wasn't a large statement. It wasn't accompanied by fanfare. But it was the first time in 9 years that she had described my profession to a child without a qualifier attached. And I noticed it the way you notice sun after a long stretch of gray weather, quietly, gratefully, without needing to announce it. I didn't bring up the years of comments after that. I considered it once or twice in the abstract, imagined laying it all out clearly, demanding acknowledgement of the specific cost those years had carried. I decided against it, not because I had forgotten, but because I understood, finally, that the version of respect I actually wanted wasn't retroactive. I didn't need her to relitigate the past. I needed the present to be different, and it was. Vikram, once fully recovered, said something to me privately that I think about more than anything Kamini ever offered. We were sitting in his garden months later, and he said, "I've been thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been the surgeon on call that day. Someone else would have operated, probably very well. But you were there, and you knew exactly what needed to happen, and you didn't hesitate." "I hesitated plenty," I said. "You just weren't awake for that part." He laughed, which turned into a small wince, because his abdomen was still healing. "I used to just think of you as Arjun's wife," he said, more seriously. "I'm ashamed of that now. You're not an extension of my son. You're your own person, doing something extraordinary, and I didn't see it clearly until I needed it." That admission, quiet and unpolished, meant more to me than anything Kamini could have said, because it came without an audience, without obligation, simply as one person telling another something true. I think about the years before that operation, often, not with bitterness, though I won't pretend the bitterness never existed, but with a kind of clarity that only comes with distance. Kamini's dismissiveness wasn't really about me. It was about a woman who had built her entire sense of worth around a form of expertise the world had stopped applauding as loudly as it once did, and who found it easier to diminish an unfamiliar kind of skill than to expand her definition of what skill could mean. That understanding doesn't erase the years of small wounds, but it lets me hold them without needing her to suffer for them, which is, I've come to believe, the only kind of peace available in situations like this one. I never needed Vikram's surgery to prove anything. My competence existed in every operation I performed before that day, and every one I've performed since, most of them for people who never doubted me at all. But I won't pretend that watching my mother-in-law finally see what I do, clearly, without a qualifier, without a comparison to someone else's cooking, didn't loosen something in my chest that had been tight for 9 years. The apology I actually value wasn't a sentence. It was a woman introducing her granddaughter to what her aunt does for a living, without flinching, without softening it into something smaller than it is. That was enough. It didn't need to be more than that.